Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining. We're very excited to start our next webinar in this series. We've done a few already, but this particular one will be about FinTech and everything related to FinTech, from venture capital funding to, insights from another special guest that we have today. We have Nadine from Sarwa. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a quick presentation. We'll jump in to a Q&A with Nadine, where I will first ask a few questions, about the FinTech space, the opportunities, the challenges that they face, and what they think. But also, we want to open it up to you, as in, what questions do you have? Is it about, again, opportunities? Is it about fundraising for FinTech specifically? We want to hear from you. So if you already have some questions ready, you can just submit them in the chat or the Q&A box that's available to you, and we'll come back to them at the end of this webinar. So very quickly, if I can get, yes, there we go. As I mentioned, we'll jump in very quickly to a presentation. We've recently at MAGNiTT released a FinTech report. So we will present a few slides from that, just to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening in the market. And that will be a quick 5 minutes, just to give you a little bit of a feel of what's going on. So that will be about funding, the top investors in FinTech startups, for example, but also the verticals that are trending within FinTech and the countries that see the most deals. And after that, we will have 5 or 10 minutes of me asking Nadine questions, and we have a few prepared just to get the conversation started. But after that, we want, again, your questions to see what you think and what your questions are for Nadine or for MAGNiTT if it's a data-related question. But without further ado, we talk a lot about FinTech, and that's not without reason, because if you look at this chart and the number of deals and total funding in the sector, you see that the deals have increased a lot over the last 5 years. So in 2019, there were 75 FinTech deals that took place in the Middle East and North Africa, so the entire region. And these are all equity investments. So when an investor invests their money in exchange for a stake in a startup, and in total in 2019, there was 80 million that was invested. When you look at what stage those startups are at, though, you see that a lot of them are still early stages. So you can think about seed investments, maybe even angel investments. So the small early stage tickets that are the first or the second round that a startup raises, those account for the vast majority of all the investments that take place in the entire region. And a big part of that is the accelerator programs. So accelerators very much focus on FinTech as a sector. And if you look at a startup bootcamp, for example, they have a dedicated FinTech accelerator in both Cairo and Dubai. And in Egypt as well, for example, you have EFG EV FinTech, which again is a dedicated accelerator for FinTech. And if you look at what are the types of startups that actually raise funding, what type of FinTech startups, you see that it's not your blockchain, it's not your deep tech, artificial intelligence. It's very rudimentary, as in these are the startups that are trying to create the infrastructure for the financial services and the FinTech sector. So payments and remittances, where you very simply have a wallet, or you can send money from point A to point B, those account for the majority of FinTech deals. And secondly, wealth management. Of course, Sarwa is an important player in that field as well. Also sees a lot of traction in the FinTech space. And when it comes to InsurTech, RegTech, capital markets, those are the ones that provide, again, the online infrastructure to make it easier for you, the consumers, to to be able to use those services. As you know, we'll touch upon a little bit later, there are some antiquated markets. And of course, as a startup, you want a big market to disrupt. And lastly, before we join the Q&A, it's just about what are the countries that actually raise those deals in the region. And as you can see, the UAE and Egypt, they account for a lot of the deals in the region. But you also see other countries that are emerging. So you see Saudi Arabia, for example, they have a lot of FinTech initiatives from our government level. And you also see that in Bahrain, in Egypt, in a lot of different countries in the region. But if you look at the UAE, it has been one of the hubs in the region for startups and venture capital funding. And that still goes for FinTech funding as well. And they account for 43% of all deals in 2019. So that was just to give you a little bit more information about the FinTech ecosystem. But of course, we want to hear a little bit more from an active player in the ecosystem already. So I have a few questions prepared for you, Nadine, and we'd love to hear your opinion on the FinTech ecosystem. So the first question that I have is that you do see a big increase in the number of deals, in FinTech deals in the region. Why do you think VCs are so attracted to FinTech as an industry?
I believe that FinTech recently has found itself at the core of innovation economies globally. So it's not just purely regionally, but so as you know, in the last decade, there's been an increase in funding towards FinTech from around what was 5% to like around 20% globally. And that also cascades down to the region. And at the end of the day, given the digitalization of financial services that's taking like across the globe, and more precisely here in the region, there's a lot of room for disruption. There's a lot of room for change. It's the pace of change is happening at an exponential rate, and there's a lot of pinpoints to address here specifically. And I think you see that happening across a lot of the verticals within the financial industry. Whether it's InsurTech, as you talked about, whether it's RegTech, whether it's again open banking, whether it's loyalty cards, and specifically wealth management and robo-advisory and robo-services.
Yeah, and we see that, you know, the payments and the wealth management, they raise a lot of money, and you know the number of deals in those specific verticals are very high. I don't know about payments, but for wealth management, why do you think that that is the case? Like, why are VCs so interested in wealth management startups?
I think it's really it varies. So you have a lot of pros and cons within the different verticals. And one of the things that VCs, I believe, look into is the unit economic behind the fintechs, and wealth management offers quite an interesting market because it's driven and focused by demographically focused products. And you can also sort of view it as a lifestyle product. So it's quite interesting how it's addressing a need in the market, especially here.
Sorry, which demographics are you talking about? Like which demographics within the region?
You can for sure segment it and go after a specific market that you want to address. Let's say, so for us, Sarwa, we say that we are democratizing investment and making it available to everyone, specifically catering to young professionals. So we actually make investing easy and simple by using technology and trying to help people to invest in a better future, to save for a better future. So it is something that was born out of a need. And at the end of the day, like any startup, you just have to find that problem that you're solving for and go after it, and potential of the market, right? So that's something that investors are always looking for, which is the opportunity of scaling and growth. while keeping in mind, of course, the unit economic and how you're approaching your growth strategy.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned unit economics a few times. Do you think that fintech startups specifically have favorable unit economics within, you know, the broader scope of startups, or is it just in general?
That's a very good question, and I think VCs here in the region specifically are more comfortable with other industries, and now they're starting to be very interested in fintech. Now there you see more maturity across the stakeholders when it comes to financial technology, and what are the unit economics that we have that are very different. Typically here it's been very driven by e-commerce, so you do have a very different approach, whether it's the growth approach, whether it's your cost of acquisition, whether it's how do you scale, the challenges that you face. But again, with everything we've mentioned, there's a massive opportunity, and the understanding of the market and how the market here is segmented offers challenges. But if you're able to crack these challenges, then you unlock massive growth opportunity. Okay. So that's I think it's a balance between the two. Okay. If that makes sense.
It does, yes. But when you talk about the challenges and the opportunities within the fintech space, what are the 1-2 opportunities, and maybe also the 1-2 challenges that you maybe as Sarwa or just within the larger fintech space do you think startups face?
Majorly, there's a lot of regulatory challenges that you need to navigate, right? As a financial technology, it is something that we keep in mind. The challenges that any startup would face, there's a lot of them that are common and across, and there's a lot of them that are specific to financial technology specifically. So if you think about, you know, the challenges that startup here in the region specifically face, we can talk about raising funds, we can talk about market product fit, and how can you actually get your early adopters, and how can you scale beyond that. Yeah. But for financial technologies, I think navigating local regulations is something that should be looked into a little bit more in depth. Yeah. As you know, we have had great support from a lot of government entities. Yes. And I think that's something you also want to talk about.
Yes.
But that being said, the market is still a little bit siloed. There have been a lot of efforts in aligning all the different regulators. But for a startup to scale, for financial technology to scale, you have to be able to work with the different regulators and look into the different segments.
Okay. Right? And we as MAGNiTT, we see that a lot of regulators, as you said, they're very much looking at the fintech sector, and they launch their accelerators, their funds, their regulations around it. What do you think about those developments, and what do you think are additional things that might be that could be done, you know, to further spur innovation, especially in the fintech space?
Given the maturity of the market, given the fact that the ecosystem is still developing here, and specifically the financial technology, there is a need for a top-down approach. Because a lot of people would tell you, let the ecosystem grow organically. And a lot of the more mature markets, you would see that happening. Yeah. The region needs more support when it comes to pushing startups to be able to grow and to be able to compete with all the big institutions that have already been here for a long time and are rooted in the financial industry. Yeah. So a top-down approach helps a lot of startups, and having accelerators in place, incubators in place, puts you also very closely with the regulators. So you're able to talk to them on a day-to-day basis, to show them how, you know, your business model is working, what needs to be done in order to provide really ease of doing business across the different markets and so on. So I do believe that's a very good thing, and it is giving a great push for all the stakeholders to come together and to sort of align on where to take the industry.
Okay, interesting. And again, at MAGNiTT, we see a lot of not necessarily governments, but also corporations getting into the fintech space, like even, you know, not in the startup space, but within the larger corporates, fintech is the next big thing, you could almost say. And you see that, you know, STC, they have their STC Pay, Kareem, they have launched their payment options. And not only within the region, you see it in China, Southeast Asia as well. What do you think about those companies coming into the fintech markets, and how do you approach it?
It's a question we're asked quite often, but there's two ways to look into it. And I think if you want to take the approach of being open to collaboration, a lot of these big corporations, they are trying to find a solution where they have a one-stop shop for all of their customers from A to Z. And it's all about right now, in today's world, it's about that user experience and how to retain your client into this one platform, right?
Yeah.
From a startup perspective, the way we look into it is there is a big potential to collaborate and to partner. And a way to view it is to look into your blind spots and see, let's say, you want an access to capital, maybe that strategic partner can provide that. You want access to data or client bases and so on. So we just focus on where can we collaborate and how can we grow together. And you potentially can find ways, and it doesn't have to be equity-based, so it could be a commercial partnership, different ways of collaboration. But there is definitely need to actually to have the big corporates sit with the smaller startups and with the newcomers into the market and see what can these startups offer us, because at the end of the day, there's this big comparison between the corporates being the big Titanic and the startups being the small boat, right? So startups are able to maneuver a lot of the little challenges that a corporate would face, whether it's bureaucracy and length of decision making and so on. We move very fast. And we're very aggressive, and we're very focused at the same time. And we take that one vertical and we keep hammering at it and developing it and maturing it, right? So you do tend to have a lot of solution given that can support what the big corporates are doing. So it's just about, again, working together.
And do you think that corporations in the region, that I see, or we see a lot of them trying to get into the fintech space, and that could be through the launch of, you know, and let's say an STC Pay or a Kareem that is getting into the fintech space. But you mentioned collaboration. Do you see a lot of corporations going into the fintech space with that mindset as well? Is it a collaborative mindset as well?
I think you see both, to be very fully transparent. I think you do see a lot of the big corporates, whether they're banks or just holding groups or companies across, that want to also learn from the startups, that want to digitalize. A lot of them are facing issue when it comes to understanding specifically the newer segment, right? How do you address a demographic that they're not necessarily comfortable or they don't know how to get to. And these startups have already cracked that and have already found, you know, their spot within this ecosystem. And I'll give you an example of Sarwa. We actually recently closed our Series A, and our lead investor, who's Kipco, is a strategic partner. Is someone that we look for when we talk about potential partnerships.
And just for the people that are not familiar with Kipco, their strategic partners are what type of entities? Are they financial entities? Are they just across the board?
It's across the board, but they do have financial institution and insurance, and they do real estate, so it's across the board.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And just for the people that might want to, you know, learn a little bit more about the fintech ecosystem, we encourage you to submit your questions as well, so that we can answer them on the spot and you know, provide you a little bit more insight into the fintech ecosystem. But in general, you know, you are a founder, you've just raised you know, your Series A big funding round, but if you are a startup or even before that, an entrepreneur or potential entrepreneur, would you advise them to go into the fintech space?
Absolutely. I mean, there are some challenges, but at the end of the day, it's a space that offers a lot of opportunity. And the fact is, you look into the value chain of financial industries, and there's a lot of room for improvement. Whether it's simplifying the offering, whether it's adding product, whether it's making it more accessible, cheaper, right? So affordable and streamlining processes. So there is a lot of different things to look into. A lot of people right now, especially in the VC and investment world, are also excited about digital banks and so on. But that doesn't mean that it's one vertical that you can only look at. Right now, the really exciting space is these little added within the value chain.
Okay. And do you think that, potential entrepreneurs and startups, are they the ones to solve that? Or do you think that those are the corporates that, they will eventually end up, providing the infrastructure, either through collaborations with startups, or how do you see that playing out?
Potentially both. I'm rooting for the startups.
Of course, we all are.
But it also, it's about what can we offer to the customer, to the client, and how can we really better the experience that we have. I'm from the region, so to me it's extremely important to see all the services evolve in the right direction. Like we spoke about before, when you look into North America, when you look into Europe, the market itself has been way more mature than what we see here, especially in every front when it comes to financial technology. And I think we do have every infrastructure needed to make it happen. It's just about, I guess, putting all the stakeholders together, aligning everyone, and pushing on that front.
Okay, makes sense.
You asked me about what would I advise new entrepreneurs to go into that. Again, I think FinTech specifically, the great thing about it is regulation, because it's both a barrier to entry, so it's protecting you if you're able to penetrate that market. Then that also gives you a little bit of a barrier from competition.
Okay, that makes sense.
As long as you keep innovating.
Right? So that makes sense. Okay. I will read one or two questions from the audience right now. Let me just have a quick look. I see one over here. Okay. Ashan asks, can FinTech entrepreneurs compete on pricing against banks? So such as offer products at lower rates than, the obviously bigger banks that are in the region?
My answer is yes, because that's one of the value propositions of Sarwa. And I can in full transparency say that at the end of the day, because we're using technology, because we're a team that was relying on everything that's automation and tech, and we are a company that's built in the cloud, as they like to say, we're able to reduce our margins and we're able to compete on the fees with the big institution. You will see the rest of the ecosystem also following, because that's how you, at the end of the day, make everything equal. But currently, we do compete with the big institutions.
Okay. And Mo asks, how do you overcome the education problem with a market that is so used to using traditional financial services? A very interesting question.
You look into the different ways that you can tackle your marketing growth and growth strategy, and you look into the different channels, and you always try to push and find where your clients are and go to them, explaining, why it's important to do so, how do you do it. But there's a lot of, again, usage of digital platform, and whether it's in terms of creating a lot of content to explain, how you do it, similar to what you guys are doing right now, right here. So it's just educating via podcasts, videos, blogs. Everything currently is available online. So we just want to encourage people to just start researching, looking into whatever information that can help them. And like I said, there's a lot of information out there.
Yes. We have a question here. What kind of opportunities are available in the Gulf, specifically in the payment space? So whether that's within banking or within FinTech, for example. as we mentioned in one of the previous slides, within the payments and remittances space, it's still the payment gateways, for example, or transferring money from A to B, where we see most of the investment happening. It's not the more advanced, if you will, applications. It's very, beginning to build the framework upon which those types of institutions or startups can function. So I would say that it's within those types of applications where you can still find, an inefficiency and a large market to tackle. So that would be the beginning of what I would do personally. One second. If you have questions here. From your point of view, is the cooperation with governments to create an open banking environment promising, or are there still a lot of issues? That's a very good question. And
who's gonna
yes, we do see that a lot of governments, like we said, they are getting into this space, or they have already had a lot of initiatives. And we see that in multiple countries. It's not just the UAE or just Saudi Arabia, it's across the region that you see governments really doubling down on things like that. And within the open banking space, I don't know the ultimate goal of the governments, but you see that a lot of them, they are trying to create a grassroots environment for startups and for entrepreneurs to create solutions for many different things that are in the country. So there are a lot of government initiatives, and that is very good. It's just about the different sectors within fintech that they are focused on. So you see a sandbox, for example, which is a regulatory environment. A lot of governments in the region have launched a sandbox like that, as we've covered in our fintech report, for example. But that's very much for any early stage fintech startup to find the right the product market fit, to find the right technical solutions to what they're trying to solve. And it's not necessarily just for open banking. It's a wider spectrum. Let me see if we have another question.
Infrastructure?
Yes, on infrastructure, are there any infrastructure detriments facing the region that will hamper innovation if the markets, governments, or regulators cannot resolve them? That's a very interesting question. And I don't know if you want to take a stab at that one.
I think it's a question that needs a lot of, it has a lot of depth, and I think you addressed some points earlier on, but yes, there are still challenges. Yes, they're being addressed. When it comes to the ecosystem itself, you have different players. You have your regulators, you have your investors, you have your accelerators and incubators, you have your private sector, and then you have the startups. And that altogether builds your ecosystem. That is the core of the infrastructure that we need. I think, another aspect of it is the talent that we have in the region, and I think that boils down to education. I think there should be more also emphasis on going to universities, going to schools, educating the generation that's about to join the workforce on what is needed, how can we address it, and how can we build that together. When it comes to laws and regulations, there's a lot of work being done on that front. And just as you were mentioning, it's a long process. We're still in the beginning of it. The market's still maturing slowly but surely, and we're getting there. There's more work to be done on open banking and on passporting between countries, because currently for financial technology is something that new entrepreneurs need to be aware of. We need to be regulated in every single entity. So as Sarwa, we're regulated in Dubai, in the IFC and the FSA. We're also regulated in ADGM in Abu Dhabi. And if we're expanding into new markets, we have to also work with the regulators in these new markets. That being said, just by being regulated in one of these initial markets across the GCC, it helps because the regulators, they do actually collaborate, but there could be more alignment that takes place.
Makes sense. Okay, we have here a question from an anonymous attendee that says, are there any developments happening on the infrastructure in the region? And as Nadine mentioned, there's a lot of development, both from a startup, from a government perspective, but especially within the startups, as we showed, it's still early stage, which is, you know, it's still early stage, but that also means that there's a lot of opportunity for startups within that space to provide that infrastructure in a country, in the region, maybe even expand beyond the region. So yes, there is infrastructure being built because there's a large opportunity there. It's just at the earlier stages, which provides a bigger opportunity as well. We have here a question about open APIs. I don't know how familiar you are with APIs, but can you share your view on how open APIs will create fintech opportunities in the region?
Oh, massive.
Yes.
Not all financial institutions or all stakeholders within our industry have open APIs currently, but it's something that we're seeing more and more, and to us is extremely important because, again, for new fintechs, they're mostly tech forwarded, right? And to be able to work with anyone, you need to be able to connect, and you need to be able to now there's another side to it, which is data and data protection, and how can you silo this. So again, for, let's say, for big institutions to work with startups, I think they're still figuring it out. We are in the process of partnering with a couple of financial players, just because it is needed to actually to be able to scale and to be able to streamline the processes.
Makes sense.
So it is something that we're seeing more and more for sure.
Okay, interesting. We will take one or maybe two more questions, and then we'll call it a day. And it's just that we want to keep it concise, and the information available to everybody. It will be shared after the webinar as well. So if you want to rewatch anything that we've just said, or want more information on the FinTech report or Sarwa, what they are doing, how they are doing it, you will be able to do so afterwards. It's again about, we have a question here about Apple Pay and STC Pay entering the market. It's about the corporate payment platforms, and how do you see that in the region, especially, we mentioned STC Pay, but what about, let's say, a Samsung or an Apple that is coming in from abroad, so from outside of the region?
A lot of the startups, and that's globally, would tell you. So I'm going to split the question into two. The ones coming from abroad, I think they will face challenges because at the end of the day, there is points to be given to a startup that's been built from the market, within the market, that has completely localized the product and the services and the customer support versus someone that's completely new to the market. So again, it's about adapting to the offering that's here, and when you're local, it's a very different value proposition.
And just to add to that, and with these things, it's not only within FinTech, right? So when we talk about, let's take a transport, for example, within the region, Kareem was the go-to player, and Uber from outside of the market had great difficulty competing in this space because there were small nuances that a local company picked up on that an outsider might not necessarily do so. And the same goes for, let's say, a Souk that was acquired by Amazon as well. I will take one last question, and it's more of a data related question. Mehraj asked, do you have a list of VCs who invest in FinTech in the UAE? We actually do have a list on MAGNiTT. We have, as I mentioned, launched our FinTech report very recently, in which we rank all the investors by number of investments in FinTech startups. You know, what stage of development were those startups? So who is the most active investor at the early stage, at Series A, maybe even Series B. So that's all available on the MAGNiTT platform. All right. Well, Nadine, thank you very much for joining. I appreciate it. And we appreciate your questions as well, of course. And we just want to, you know, get more information out there. As MAGNiTT, we always look to provide as much information to our audience as possible, just to create the transparency of data and information. So, and as I mentioned, afterwards, you will all receive an email where you can you know, look back at this specific webinar, but also look at what MAGNiTT does, what Sarwa does, how you can use it, you know, the report, or maybe investing with Sarwa. So that will all be available to you. Yeah. So thank you very much. And thank you. And we hope to see you in the next one, as this is a series of webinars that we are doing with great partners like Sarwa. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.